Transport in plants. Transport in plants. How do plants get things to move around? Unlike animals that have muscles and use energy to pump blood and move things around, right? They move things around, they pump their blood. Remember, unlike animals, plants have no options for that. They have to rely on other mechanisms. Plants don't have muscles, right? So what do? Well, first of all, let's talk about water movement. Water is important to plants. How do plants move water from one place to another? All right. If we draw a simple sort of representation of a typical plant, we'll put a circle at the bottom, and we'll put a little tube up here. We'll put a circle at the top. Okay? The bottom represents the root system. And the top represents the leaves. Essentially, we want to get water to move from the roots to the leaves. First of all, the roots are in the ground, and that's where the water is. The water is in the ground, and so it can be absorbed by the roots, and then it can be absorbed by the xylem tissue, the xylem tubes, remember? So the movement of water is really all about the xylem tubes. But how do you get it from the roots up the tree? Well, at the leaves of the tree, there's a lot of photosynthesis going on. So let's remind ourselves of photosynthesis. Let me just go up a bit. Water is leaving here because with photosynthesis, you have to take carbon dioxide and add it to water to make the glucose, the sugar. There it is, and the oxygen. So that means that water is being removed. It's being taken out by this process. That's a fairly small amount of water, though, compared to another problem that the leaves have, right? The leaves have the problem of the stomates that are open. The stomates that are open because they're trying to get a gas exchange. They're trying to get the CO2 they need and get rid of the oxygen, but at the same time, those stomates are allowing water to escape. So there's a very large movement of water out of the leaves because of this process. And then the process of water leaving leaves from the stomates is called transpiration. About 90% of the water in a tree can leave this way. It's wasted. Oops, let me spell that right. Transpiration. And if you go back to our video on the leaves, you can see how the stomates open and close according to the water availability. And so a lot of water is lost. So at the top of the plant, where the leaves are, water is being lost to the environment or used up in photosynthesis. And at the bottom, it's moving in. So what I guess I could have written those in blue, those arrows, because they're the movement of water. Let's put water here, moving out, right? Moving out of the plant. So we call the place where the water's sort of being lost, we call that a sink. Like the water's going down the drain in the sink and disappearing. And we call down here where the roots are a source because the water is moving in from the ground, assuming that it's rained recently and the ground is moist. So we have this source and sink idea. Now, because the water's leaving at the top, there's an osmotic pressure, right? The water would like to move up this way. Let me go back to blue here. The water would like to move up from the region where there's lots of it to the region where there's less of it. But it can't move unless it's helped by two important properties of water. And the fact that these properties only become useful if the tube, right? If the tube is very, very thin. So instead of one big tube, what we have inside a plant are many little tubes, right? The xylem tubes, and they're all about a cell thick. They're all very small. There they are, the xylem tubes all fused together. So that if you were to cut open a plant cross-section, you wouldn't see one tube. You'd see a whole bunch of tubes. And each of these tubes would be all filling in this area. Each of these tubes would be just a cell thick. So they're incredibly small. And that means, because they're small, that means that water can climb the tubes because of two important properties. One is called cohesion. And this is the fact that water molecules will stick to each other. Water molecules stick to each other. So if one moves, the other will pull along behind it. And like a chain. Oops, to each other. Let's go careful here. To each other. There we go. Cohesion. And the reason for that has to do with the fact that the water molecule is polar, and it has positive and negative sides, right, or poles. And the positive pole of one water molecule can pull on the negative pole of another because opposite charges attract. And then there's the property of adhesion, which is water molecules can also stick to other molecules besides water. Water molecules stick to other molecules, and it's for the same reason. Because they're polar and they have a positive and a negative side, those polar regions can attract to other regions of other molecules that have these polar charges on them. Polarity is very important in biology. Water molecules stick to other molecules. So that means that the water molecules can stick to the side of the tube. And if you pour water in a glass, and you dump the water out, it doesn't all come out. Some of it stays stuck on the glass, right? And you can see little drops of water sort of stuck around on the glass. And that's because of the adhesion. So what that means is in the xylem, if I go back to my picture, up here, in this xylem tube right here, as the water molecule is pushed upwards by the pressure, it'll also stick to the sides of the tube, and it will stick to each other, causing like a little tug of war where the molecules will pull themselves up, and as they're pushed up, they will climb the tube, literally climb the tube. This has a name, by the way. It's called capillary action. A capillary is a small tube, just like in blood vessels, right? The capillaries are tiny, tiny tubes. Capillary action is the climbing of the water up the tube because of the push from the osmotic pressure, but also because of the adhesion and cohesion properties of the water molecule itself. And this is enough to get this water to climb many, many, many meters. Tallest trees can be, hundreds of feet high. Excuse me. And we can get water all the way up to the top quite easily through this process. Notice it doesn't require a heart to pump or muscles to push. It relies on the physical properties of water and osmosis and the actual fact that the water is leaving at the leaves and entering at the roots for the most part. Okay, let's move on then to that's how we move water, so that's easy enough. How do we move the sugar that we're making? Because that has to move too. So the next part is the movement of sugars. Because remember, the sugars are all being made at the top of the tree in the leaves. But they have to be moved down the tree because other tissues in the tree need sugar to work and do their job. And sometimes they're even used as storage. Remember we talked about how the roots can store starches and sugars, like a carrot, right? And make vegetables that we typically eat. So now the second part is how do we move sugars? The sugars are moved primarily through the phloem tissue. Remember, the phloem is alive, the xylem is dead. The xylem tissue in this particular model up here doesn't have to do anything except form a tube, and the water takes care of the rest. So there's no need to be alive. A dead tube works quite well. But down here, to move the sugar, things are a little trickier And we have to be alive to do it because it's going to require some energy. So here's the deal. I'll draw this one sort of the opposite way. So we'll draw a circle at the top and a tube going down and a circle at the bottom, like this. So this would represent the phloem sieve tubes, okay? And around the phloem at the top, I'm going to draw some cells that are photosynthesizing, like the leaves. So because these cells are photosynthesizing, they're making lots of sugar, which I'm going to put as red dots. Okay? Now that means that in the xylem, there will also be lots of sugar because it will seep through, right? There'll be sugar here, lots of it. So we call this the source of the sugar. Source. It's where the sugar is being made, and it's being made by photosynthesis. That says photosynthesis. And remember, sugar is being made from carbon dioxide, using up water to make sugar, glucose, and some oxygen. So there's my red dots, all being made. Now there will be some red dots down below, but not as much because down below there are other cells down here, other plant cells. I'm going to draw them in a different color because they're not really photosynthesizing, are they? What they're doing is they're using up the sugar in some way. Maybe they're storing the sugar, or maybe they're using it to produce energy. So what happens here is the sugar, it's being used, it's going out. So it's used up. This would be the sink where the sugar is used up. So in this case, we could write the equation backwards. Here, the glucose is being burned up with oxygen to produce the energy the cells need to do their thing. We often forget that plants do this. We often think that plants do photosynthesis and only animals do this, but the truth is plants do both because they need energy just like animals. So plants are now using up the very sugar, but in fact, that's why they make sugar. They don't make it for us to eat. They could care less about us. They make sugar for themselves to use. And so the sugar is being used up here. And of course, the result is we're getting energy. And that energy is basically for the plant to be alive and do all the jobs of life. Now, if we imagine what would happen, let's remember that there's water and fluid all around these cells, right? So if there's water and fluid all around these cells, and you look at the top, if there's lots of sugar there, it creates a concentration gradient. Outside here, there's no sugar, but lots of sugar in. Now what would normally happen is the sugar would move by diffusion to balance that out. But the membrane of the phloem tube does not allow that. It's selectively permeable. It holds sugar in, but it does let water move. So the next best thing is for the water to rush in by osmosis to try and water it down. Just like our experiment with the egg that we did when we put the egg in the water and watched the water go in and swell up the egg. If water goes in at the top, that creates pressure because the water's filling up and stretching the tube, which means the pressure will push water this way. And as the water moves this way, it will bring with it the salts, or sugars, the sugars that are dissolved in it. So this causes a sugar to move. Now, if nothing happened, after a while, all the sugar would move, the water would stop going in because the gradient would be evened out, and everything would stop. So how do you keep it going perpetually? What happens is the plant uses active transport to push sugar into here continuously. They have to use active transport because you're pushing sugar into a place where there's already lots of sugar. So you're pushing up or against a concentration gradient. So sugar is actively pumped, active transport, which means it uses up energy. pushes sugar against the concentration gradient into the phloem at the source. And that means that you constantly have high sugar, which keeps the water constantly moving in, which means there's a constant high pressure, which means that the water will constantly move this way towards the sink and will pull with it the sugars. And the sink will always have less sugar because the sugar is being used up. So we're making use of active transport, or energy that's being used by the cells. The xylem did not do this. The water flow did not require any active input, but it was sort of just the result of the properties of water, essentially. But here, the plant has to work a little bit to push the sugar around. Because in order to push the sugar, you have to move it against the concentration gradient to load it into the phloem. To get the water to follow it, the water then follows and pushes everything through. So this is what we call the pressure flow hypothesis. And the truth is there's still more to be learned about how plants do this. We don't have it fully understood, but we have a pretty good idea that this is the basic premise behind it. So we call it the pressure flow hypothesis because we still haven't completely confirmed all of the little details. We have basically just confirmed the main ideas. And that's how plants transport water and sugar. So you have to think about sources and sinks, where there's more of something and where there's less of something, where it's being produced and where it's being used. And then you have to think about how concentration gradients and osmosis work in those situations. And in this case, the active transport required to keep everything moving. And that's all we need to say about transport in plants.